Previously, we looked at the origins and the early service life of the Curtiss P-40, an aircraft considered by some to be one of the most underrated fighters of the Second World War, and today we're going to continue our exploration of its history. Additionally, we're also going to briefly touch on why the success of the P-40 wasn't exactly good for Curtiss-Wright in the long run. This is, of course, part 2 of a single long video, so if you haven't seen part 1, I highly recommend you do so before watching this, otherwise some things probably won't make a lot of sense. So, last time we looked at the Curtiss Hawk 81, the early model of the P-40. This was known in America as the Warhawk, and pretty much everywhere else it inherited the British name of Tomahawk. These early P-40s were built in modest numbers. Only 525 were built for the US Army, and just under 1,200 were exported as Tomahawks. Built as a stopgap, simply to fill the ranks until more advanced fighters arrived, they saw little use at home. The US P-40s led a quiet life before being decimated at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines, but the Tomahawks saw far more active service, and they quickly showed that the P-40 was a far more promising design than originally thought. They saw extensive use with Commonwealth forces in North Africa and the Middle East, the American Volunteer Group in Burma, and with the Soviet Air Force on the Eastern Front. They were a much-needed relief for many air units, many of whom were using outdated aircraft that were little more than flying target practice for their enemies, but there was room for improvement. This led to the development of the XP-46, a potential replacement for the P-40 itself, which ultimately failed, something that we'll get to in a later part of this video. But at the same time, the Air Force also asked Curtiss to find ways to improve the current P-40s as they were. Improving the P-40 meant addressing its biggest weakness, the engine. Currently, the P-40s were powered by the C-series of the Allison V1710, usually the -19 or the -33 variant. These produced around 1,090 horsepower, which was enough to keep them competitive at the start, but only just. Almost all its rivals had lighter airframes, particularly the Germans, and the P-40 struggled at high altitude. The Allison engine utilized a single-stage supercharger, and while most P-40s had a service ceiling of 29,000 feet on paper, in reality they were woefully ineffective above 15,000. Because of this, they saw little or no service in Western Europe, the only theatre that saw widespread high-altitude combat, but to remain competitive elsewhere, the P-40 needed to increase power. Unfortunately, this wasn't as simple as beefing up the existing engine and its supercharger. The C-series engine used an internal spur reduction gearbox, and this was rated to handle just over 1,100 horsepower. The current engine was already pushing this limit, and with Curtiss asking for even more, Allison was left with little choice but to redesign it. The result was the F-series of the V1710. The D-series was an experimental pusher variant, and the E-series featured a remote gearbox for the P-39. This new engine featured an external reduction gearbox that was bolted onto the crankcase. It was sturdier than the previous unit, being able to handle up to 1,150 horsepower from the engine, and it significantly reduced the overall size of the power plant. Now, I'm not an expert at explaining mechanical things when it comes to engines. Understanding aerodynamics and astrophysics has always been my strong suit, but these illustrations do a good job at explaining the size difference between the C and the F-series. These are taken from the official operating manuals, which can be found on the Air Corps library. I'll put a link down below, so if you want to dig a bit deeper into it, I heartily recommend checking that website out. But, in a nutshell, the new engine was 10 inches or 25 centimeters shorter than the previous model, despite the reduction gearbox being mounted externally. This was because the gearbox was mounted between the cylinder banks. Now, this did come at the cost of raising the thrust line by a fair amount, but the benefit of increased power and weight reduction was considered more than worth it. Though an improvement on the previous model, there was one major problem. The engine retained the single-stage supercharger, meaning its peak performance altitude was almost unchanged from the previous model, being a mere 15,000 feet. There were a number of reasons for this, which probably go beyond the scope of this video as we're focusing on the plane and not its engine, but two big ones were time and manpower. A two-stage supercharger could be done, and indeed this was eventually tested in a small capacity later on, but developing and testing it would take time, and in 1940 time was a scarce commodity. Additionally, Allison was not a huge company, and they had their hands full with developing and mass-producing the engine as it was, and diverting resources away from the production line at such a critical juncture couldn't really be countenanced. As the new engine didn't conform to the existing nose of the P-40, thanks to its shorter length and raised thrust line, Curtiss engineers had to make some alterations, and they took the opportunity to make some improvements to the P-40's airframe. This resulted in a completely redesigned nose and fuselage, and the change was large enough to have the aircraft redesignated from the Hawk 81 to the Hawk 87. Despite the changes, the Army retained the military designation of P-40, and the new version would be ordered as the P-40D. It featured a number of improvements over the old model. Not only was the fuselage shorter, courtesy of the redesigned engine, but it was also slightly shallower, which improved its streamlining. The radiator intakes were moved forward almost in line with the spinner, with the installation of new radiators resulting in a further deepening of the aircraft's chin, and because the propeller was raised slightly higher, the landing gear was shortened, which improved handling on the ground. Along with changes to the airframe, the P-40's protection and armament was also improved. To improve visibility for the pilot, the cockpit opening was deepened, with a larger sliding canopy, and this had an enlarged windshield with flat bulletproof glass in the center. The nose-mounted guns were deleted, with all armament being moved to the wings. Initially, this consisted of 4 50 caliber machine guns, but for later models of the P-40 this was increased to 6. There was also a provision in the design for mounting 2 20mm cannons in the wings instead, but this was never adapted. The new guns were mounted in large bays in the wings and aimed so that they would fire outside the propeller arc, removing the need for an interrupter gear, and the new P-40 could also carry a greater payload, one 500-pound bomb or a 70-gallon drop tank under the belly, and 2 100-pound bombs, or an equivalent in smaller bombs, underneath the wings. On paper, the Hawk 87 was an improvement over the Hawk 81. Just. While it boasted a more impressive armament and better ground strike capability, this came at the cost of added weight that impacted performance. Despite being more streamlined and having a more powerful engine, if only by about 60 horsepower in the end, the P-40D was only 5 miles an hour faster than the old P-40C. Still, it was technically better, and the first orders for the aircraft began to come in during the spring of 1940. And now we get onto the long and sometimes complicated line of P-40 variants that followed the approval of the Model 87. As there was such a large number of P-40 variants, developed over a fairly short period of time, I'll go over their details first and then cover their service history. If I were to cover the P-40D and its service history, and then the P-40E and its service history, and so on, it would get far too messy far too quickly, as multiple versions fought in multiple theaters at the same time. So, to keep things simple, let's first get a rough overview of each variant. The P-40D was produced in the smallest numbers, at least for the United States, with the Army taking delivery of just 23 in July of 1941. The British took over an old French order, which eventually totaled 560 aircraft, and they decided to rename their P-40s as the Kitty Hawk, to differentiate it from the old Model 81 Tomahawks. The first 20 or so were delivered as standard, however the rest of the order were delivered with 6-wing mounted guns, and this brought them much closer in specification to the P-40E. Approximately 1,500 of the P-40Es were built, with about a third being sent to Britain and her allies as part of the Lend-Lease. On the whole, it was fairly similar to the P-40D, however it had a beefed-up wing structure to carry larger external bombs, including 250-pounders, and the wing's fixed armament now consisted of 650 caliber machine guns as standard. As they were produced using US funds, the Lend-Lease aircraft had to come with standard US Army designations, but as they would have British equipment, their designation was altered to become the P-40E-1. Their British name was also amended, owing to the improved armament, and the new aircraft flew as the Kitty Hawk Mark 1A. After this, P-40 production took an odd but promising turn with the P-40F. Frustrated at the lack of progress in improving the performance of the Allison engine, the US government had begun to seek out alternatives. In September 1940, they chose the Packard Motor Company to build a version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin under license, and just under a year later, the Packard V1650-1 was fired up for the first time. The engine quickly proved itself to be superior to the Allison, and as it was also very similar in size, it was the perfect candidate for injecting some much-needed performance into the P-40. Curtiss converted a P-40D into the XP-40F, one of the rare times that a P-40 was actually put through a prototyping phase. The design team experimented with several locations for the radiator before settling on a layout almost identical to the Allison-powered P-40s. Because the Merlin was fitted with an updraft carburetor, the intake scoop was removed from the top of the cowling, and the radiator opening was enlarged to provide room for an air duct. This made the new P-40 easy to distinguish from its siblings. If it had a flat nose, it was powered by a Merlin. The Packard engine made a marked improvement to the Warhawk's performance. The P-40F was rated at 1240 horsepower, which gave it a top speed of 364 miles an hour, or 585 kilometers an hour, the best yet for a P-40. Better still, it could achieve this speed at a higher altitude of 20,000 feet. It wasn't quite up to its European counterparts, but it was much better than what it could do before. Impressed by the performance, the US Army quickly placed an order for 699 P-40Fs in the autumn of 1941, and this eventually grew to a production run of 1,311 units that were delivered in 5 versions between 1942 and 1943. The P-40F could have become even better, but it had its fate prematurely cut short. Packard eventually developed an excellent 2-stage supercharger that would allow their Merlins to produce power at much higher altitudes. But despite being the potential ultimate cure for the P-40's woes, it was never installed. Instead, in the spring of 1943, the Army decided to allocate all further Merlin production to the P-51 Mustang, and that was the end of that. This also affected a later model, the P-40L, which was a continuation of the F variant with a general aim of weight reduction. Designed in 5 subvariants, they each featured attempts to combat the ever-increasing weight of the P-40. Some had reduced armament and armor for weight saving, some had electrical trim tabs and engine controls, and some had revised intakes and cooling systems. Approximately 700 were built, with at least 100 going to the British as the Kitty Hawk Mark II, but their production was also curtailed when Merlin production was diverted to the P-51. This left over 100 unfinished P-40Fs and Ls without an engine. They were later refitted with Allison engines, but as they were a mixed bag of different versions, many were converted to trainers as the P-40Rs. The next production variant was the P-40K, essentially an improved P-40E. It was built in 4 major subvariants, the K1, K5, K10, and K15, and export models were known as the Kitty Hawk Mark III. It featured a newer version of the Allison engine, the V1710-73. This pumped out 1,325 horsepower and allowed it to almost match the top speed of the P-40F, which, to its credit, was an achievement. Unfortunately, it came with the old caveat of rapidly losing power once it reached altitudes above 15,000 feet, but the demand for fighter aircraft was so great that 1,300 of these were built, with deliveries beginning in August of 1942. It was around this time that various models of the P-40 began to appear with changes made to their fuselage and tail. This was to address a problem that had only become apparent once the P-40 had begun to see extensive combat service. In a dive, it suffered from poor directional stability, often wanting to roll over. This was obviously an undesirable trait, as it's difficult to aim at a target if your plane won't stop gyrating, and the risk of losing control was equally disconcerting. This unhappy trait led many pilots to comment that the speed and angle of a dive wasn't decided by the airframe, but rather the strength of the pilot's arms and legs at the controls. Curtiss designers tried several modifications to solve this problem. The first was a dorsal fin that was attached to the vertical stabilizer of the P-40K, which did apparently improve things in a dive, but not to the level expected. One airframe was fitted with a large triangular dorsal strake, but that made zero improvement and was quickly abandoned. And finally, when modifying a P-40 F1, they found a solution. They added half a meter of length to the rear of the fuselage, moving the fin back but leaving the horizontal stabilizer where it was, and that seemed to mostly fix the problem. The first production P-40 to officially feature this new change was the P-40K-10, and all others moving forward would do the same. The last two variants of the P-40 were the M and the N series. The P-40M was a follow-up to the long fuselage P-40Ks. It featured the slightly improved -81 version of the Allison engine, and could be visually identified by the addition of a cooling grill ahead of its exhaust stubs. Unfortunately, the improved engine, though more reliable, had less power, which was a bit unfortunate as the M was the heaviest model of the P-40 thus far. Even with a healthy 1125 horsepower, it barely managed 360 miles an hour, and this was considerably reduced when carrying ordnance or drop tanks. Because of this, weight reduction was once again looked at in the penultimate version of the Warhawk, the P-40N. Like the earlier versions of the P-40L, the N1 only carried 4 machine guns and it had some of its fuel tanks removed. But its weight loss program went even further. The oil coolers and radiators were replaced by lighter aluminium models, and the internal engine starter and battery was also removed. This latter choice was highly unpopular when the N1 was operated by frontline squadrons, especially in poor weather, and many squadrons chose to reinstall both the engine starter and the missing guns, thus negating the supposed performance improvement. Said improvement was noticeable when the configuration was adhered to, and the P-40 could now reach 378 miles an hour, or 608 kilometers an hour, but many pilots felt that the loss of range, convenience, and firepower was too high a price to pay. Following this, the P-40N5 featured the return of the lost armament and equipment, which increased the weight once more, but it also included some improvements that made it much more popular amongst pilots than it had been previously. Forward visibility was significantly improved thanks to a new frameless canopy, and rear visibility was also made better with the installation of clear plastic above the decking in place of sheet metal. Other improvements included better radio equipment, a new pilot's seat, and a lighter but stronger undercarriage, which was especially useful in the rough airfields of the Pacific. There were other subvariants after the N5, but they were all variants on a theme and didn't feature any significant changes. All in all, Curtiss built over 5,200 P-40Ns, making them the most numerous of the P-40s by far. It was a P-40N that would mark an important milestone for Curtiss in 1944. On November the 22nd, a P-40 rolled out of the Curtiss-Wright factory in Buffalo with a very strange paint job. Completed as the company's 15,000th Hawk fighter, it was adorned with the roundels of the 28 nations that had operated the various Hawk fighters since the 1920s. Additionally, it had 20 German crosses and 18 Japanese flags to signify the scores of the top P-40 aces in both the Army Air Force and the Royal Air Force. It was both a symbol of Curtiss-Wright's ability to churn out vast numbers of reliable aircraft, and also a statement of the P-40's unexpectedly long service life, something I had begun discussing in the previous video, and will continue to do so now. I'm going to start off with the P-40s that served with the Soviet Union. I didn't mention them at all in the last video, as the vast majority of Soviet P-40s were variants of the Model 87, and I thought covering them together would make more sense. Behind Britain, the Soviet Union was the largest foreign operator of P-40s during the Second World War, though many would not know it. When people think of Lend-Lease aircraft fighting on the Eastern Front, they usually think of the Bell P-39, which was beloved by pilots there, but just under 2,200 P-40s would also find their way into the ranks of the VVS. Of these, only 247 were old models of the P-40, the Tomahawk Mark II-B, and the rest were various models of the P-40E all the way through to the P-40N. The first unit to receive the Tomahawks was the 126th Fighter Regiment, and they did not have a good start. On the 1st of October 1941, the regiment began their brief period of training, and things on the P-40s started to break, fall off, or otherwise misbehave almost immediately. Some of their early Tomahawks and Kitty Hawks had been delivered in a used state, some were damaged in transit, and some were even delivered without functioning engines, or engines at all. Or guns, actually. Yeah, some of them were missing their guns. Some had no ammunition, some had the wrong ammunition. Honestly, the first few batches of the P-40s were pretty chaotic, and it established a poor reputation with the Soviet pilots, one that never fully recovered. Unfortunately for the 126th Regiment, their training had barely begun before they were thrown into the defense of Moscow. Between October 1941 and April 42, they logged over 900 sorties, and although most of these were to cover troop movements on the ground, they did get in the occasional scrap with enemy fighters. On paper, the numbers looked pretty good. They claimed 29 enemy aircraft destroyed for just 2 of their own. But that was only because their non-combat attrition rate was so high that the Germans never got a chance to do their job. As with many things on the Eastern Front, tanks, trucks, people, the thing that brought the P-40s down was the Russian winter. The oil, hydraulic fluid, and coolant froze rock solid, causing the radiator honeycombs to swell and crack. The rubber tires shattered, the batteries went flat, and the engines often seized. Apparently, the cooling systems of the P-40s were so seriously affected that Soviet personnel had to raid nearby villages for silverware so that they could solder the broken radiators back together. Along with grounding many aircraft, the harsh conditions also led to a number of fatal crashes. Engines would suddenly seize mid-flight, or the wings would ice over in poor weather, and they would fall from the sky like frozen coffins. The winter was so brutal on the Soviet P-40s that only 9 were airworthy in mid-January. After this horrific start, it's not surprising that many Soviet pilots viewed the P-40s with suspicion, if not dread. But by the time of the spring thaw, the next batches were arriving, usually in better condition. Engineers had figured out how to somewhat winterize the P-40 against the elements, and their luck began to improve. At the beginning, much like with the RAF, many pilots were not impressed with the P-40's handling. They valued speed and maneuverability over the P-40's strengths of sturdiness, firepower, and range, and the fighters required some getting used to. But after a time, and a change of habits, most pilots grew to like their P-40s, though many admitted that they could not love them. As a fighter, it was viewed as superior to the I-16 and the Hawker Hurricane, but inferior to the P-39 or their own Yaks or Lavochkins. Because of this, the P-40 served most of its time as an interim or training fighter. A pilot's performance in the P-40 was often used to determine whether they were sharp enough to progress to the more advanced fighters as the war progressed, or whether they had to stay back for more training. Of course, most famously, the Soviet P-40s eventually proved themselves useful in ground attack and long-range escort missions, their durability serving well in the former, and their range in the latter. They were used to strike bogged-down tank columns, forward supply dumps, and trenches. Some P-40s returned to base with considerable damage, often missing entire sections of wing, but sadly little photos of Soviet P-40s survive today, and we have to rely on pilot reports if we want to learn about its durability. One pilot who certainly valued the P-40's toughness was Alexei Klobystov. I think I've pronounced that right, apologies if I haven't. Flying a Tomahawk in 1942, he was able to ram not 1, but 2 aircraft in the same sortie. The first was a Bf-110, and the second was a Bf-109. Both times he used the starboard wing of his P-40 as the impromptu bludgeon, and enough of said wing remained after the aerial melee for Alexei to safely land in one piece. He supposedly rammed a third enemy later on, this time in a Kitty Hawk, but various source material seems to widely conflict on the circumstances. Some say he rammed a Bf-109 intentionally, others say it was a collision during a head-on pass. One declares he was bodily thrown from his cockpit by the impact, another states that he bailed out. A few say he sustained injuries from shrapnel and an engine fire, yet others say he parachuted into a tree. Because of this, I'm inclined to give Alexei 2 confirmed rammings and a probable, owing to the dubious reports, but either way it serves as both an excellent demonstration of the P-40's airframe and the tendency for Soviet pilots to engage in ramming maneuvers, something that could almost be classified as a national sport for them. The P-40's ruggedness served it equally well as a training aircraft. Many an inexperienced pilot was preserved from hard landings, ground loops, and the occasional collision with a parked truck, or even their own hangar, thanks to the ruggedness of the airframe. The P-40 proved easy to learn, which was just as well as many units were rushed into combat on minimal training, often with incorrect information courtesy of poor translation. During the course of the war, Soviet P-40s saw service patrolling convoys over Norway and the Arctic, defending the cities of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Leningrad, and performing countless strike missions in Kuban and during the offensive around Kursk. On the whole, though, their performance was mixed. They were sturdy, but they suffered terribly in the winter months, and many burned through their engines before their time was done, though this wasn't helped by the tendency of Soviet pilots to run them on emergency power for long periods of time. They never got the love that the P-39 received, and their reputation soured even more when they were moved to more defensive roles when they became obsolete. Many were stationed as interceptors, but most of the German bombing raids came by night, and the P-40s lacked the night fighting equipment and high-altitude performance to be truly effective. Because of this, most of the P-40s were phased out in 1944, being replaced by various Soviet and Lend-Lease fighters, and the Kitty Hawk's time in this theatre was mostly forgotten. While the Soviets dealt with the teething problems of their aircraft, the P-40s operated by the Allies in Africa, and the Mediterranean afterwards, were having much better luck. The Desert Air Force began taking delivery of its first Kitty Hawks in December of 1941. No. 3 Squadron of the South African Air Force was the first to receive them, and thanks to the many similarities with the Tomahawk, it only took them 11 days to complete the transition. They quickly got their combat debut on New Year's Day 1942, shooting down 4 Stukas and 1 Bf-109, in a rare case where they actually held the altitude advantage. The pilots of the Desert Air Force were disappointed that the Kitty Hawk's performance barely exceeded that of its predecessor, but on the other hand, they were proving to be just as sturdy as ever, and this led to the Kitty Hawk into one of its most famous roles of the war. The Kitty Hawk could carry a much heavier bomb load compared to its predecessor, a 500-pounder under the belly and up to 6 50-pounders under the wings. This quickly led to its use as a fighter bomber, and it was something that it did so well that it was soon given a new nickname, the Kitty Bomber. Clive Caldwell, P-40 ace and newly appointed commander of 112 Squadron, made the first test drop from a Kitty Hawk in March of 1942. 2 months later, the squadron was fully operational in this new role, and the Kitty Bombers would quickly find themselves at work. On the 26th of May, General Erwin Rommel began his new offensive, and for the next 6 weeks, Kitty Bombers of 112 Squadron were heavily involved in attacking the advancing Axis forces. Dive bombing was usually done from altitudes between 6,000 and 8,000 feet, often followed by low-altitude strafing runs on soft targets, such as trucks and supply dumps. The P-40's effectiveness in this role soon endeared it to pilots and commanders alike, and the number of operational Kitty Bombers quickly grew. By the end of the summer, the Desert Air Force had 8 squadrons of Kitty Bombers on strength, and some of these were used to train the new American squadrons that were starting to appear on the scene. The first of these, part of the 57th Fighter Group, became operational in October 1942, just in time for the major Allied offensive at El Alamein. Within 2 days of being operational, they had scored their first victories. This was an interesting time for the P-40s in Africa, with their fortunes changing on any given day. On the one hand, they were proving themselves to be thoroughly effective in the ground attack role. Their pilots were becoming more accurate with their bombs, and the large number of P-40s being delivered provided an ample supply of replacement airframes and spare parts. But, on the other hand, as a fighter, they were showing their age. The P-40 scored many victories between the summers of 1942 and 1943, but many of these were the result of circumstances and luck, rather than the merits of the P-40 as a fighting machine. The earlier Tomahawks had mostly been equal to the early German and Italian fighters they faced, but the Kitty Hawks were heavier, and this hurt their maneuverability. That being said, the German Bf-109 was suffering the same problem. The Gustav series was more powerful than the old Friedrichs, but they were also heavier, which made them more difficult to handle at low speeds and low altitudes. If the Kitty Hawks caught them in this situation, the odds were in their favour, but if the 109s had the altitude advantage, it was a different story. Technically, the old Bf-109Fs were a bigger threat, as they were lighter and more nimble, but this threat was slowly being offset by the overwhelming number of Allied aircraft that were being funneled into the African theatre. Following the landings of Operation Torch in West Africa, the Kitty Hawks enjoyed a high degree of air superiority, which did much to offset their shrinking performance against enemy aircraft. During the first half of 1943, especially in the spring months, they completed a series of missions where this superiority allowed them to rack up huge tallies against the retreating Axis forces. One of the most notable was the so-called Palm Sunday Massacre. This event involved P-40s from all three squadrons of the 57th Fighter Group, along with elements of the 324th Group, and those of RAF 92 Squadron. On the evening of the 18th of April 1943, they were performing one of many anti-transport patrols, part of a larger operation to prevent the retreat of Axis forces and supplies from Tunisia to Italy. Just before sunset, they sighted a massive formation of low-flying enemy aircraft, at least 60 Ju-52 transports that were escorted by about 21 fighters. 46 P-40s and 11 Spitfires descended upon them, coming in from the sun, and by the coming of darkness, 59 transports and 16 fighters had been sent into the Mediterranean Sea. After the Axis surrender in North Africa, the P-40s found themselves as part of the aerial vanguard in the push towards Italy. Before the landings, much of their time was spent in keeping enemy fighters across the Mediterranean occupied, so that they could not be used for the defense of Sicily. Because of this, P-40s were deployed across a vast area of coastline and saw extensive use throughout the summer. Of all the units involved, it was the P-40s of the 325th Fighter Group that became the most notorious during this period. In June, they had begun painting the tail surfaces of their P-40s with distinctive black and yellow checkers, and by the end of the summer, the checker tails had established a strong reputation through a string of stunning aerial victories. Between May and September, they claimed no fewer than 102 aerial victories in 37 missions, for the loss of just 16 of their own. They also developed a talent for finding new ways of blowing up or setting things on fire. Captain Joe Bloomer and his ground crew of the 318th Fighter Squadron turned his drop tank into a makeshift incendiary bomb by adding on a set of fins, a hand grenade, and a detonator. When the tank ran dry, he'd find a target of opportunity, drop the tank, and the remaining bit of fuel and the grenade would do the rest. Unsurprisingly, this tactic did not go on for too long, and it was ordered to be stopped for safety reasons. Apparently, commanders weren't too keen on the idea of somebody just sellotaping a grenade onto a fuel tank. When they weren't dropping dollar store fuel bombs on the enemy, the P-40s carried on with conventional explosives after the landings at Sicily and mainland Italy. But by this point, they were starting to have their thunder stolen, literally. Near the end of 1943, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt began to appear in growing numbers. It quickly started to replace the P-40s in US squadrons, and by the following summer, the only ones in service were those operated by the Commonwealth forces. It was in service to these forces that the P-40 saw the most success. Outside of Africa, where Kitty Hawks were flown by Australia, South African, and New Zealand squadrons, their other big theatre of operations was in the Pacific. Most of the action was focused in the Southwest Pacific, and so naturally most of their use would be with pilots from Australia and New Zealand. Canada did operate the P-40, with 13 squadrons operating various models of Tomahawks or Kitty Hawks, but their service was either uneventful or short-lived. Canada's proximity to Britain and to the United States meant it was easier to ship newer and more advanced fighters over, and most squadrons had converted to Spitfires or Mustangs by 1943. However, some Kitty Hawks did see a brief bit of service during the invasion of the Aleutian Islands, an often forgotten campaign where Alaska found some of its territory being invaded by Japanese forces. But overall, the P-40's time with Canada was brief, whereas with Australia and New Zealand, it was extensive and long-lasting. At the start of 1942, many veteran pilots from Africa were returning to Australia. They were desperately needed to bring the lessons of real combat experience to flight schools that were hastily expanding their training following the outbreak of war with Japan. Things quickly grew dire following the first Japanese strikes on Darwin in February. These attacks, followed by those on Broome and the fall of Java, stirred a wave of invasion panic throughout the country. The rate of the Japanese advance was shocking, and Australia had few modern fighters to defend itself should the invasion come. But at the critical moment, like a knight in vaguely camouflaged armour, the P-40 came to save the day. The US Army Air Force transferred the first of many batches of P-40s to the Royal Australian Air Force on the 8th of March 1942. They were immediately assigned to No. 75 Squadron, which had been formed a few days earlier, while two more Kitty Hawk squadrons would come together over the next week. Australian Kitty Hawks would not wait long before they saw action. Japan launched its invasion of New Guinea on the 11th of March, and 1 week later, No. 75 Squadron began moving its equipment up to Port Moresby on the southern coast. The first Kitty Hawks arrived there on the 21st, and just 2 hours after officially becoming operational, a pair of them were sent to intercept and shoot down a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, their first aerial victory of the campaign. At the beginning of fighting around Port Moresby, 75 Squadron was the sole air unit available to defend against Japanese air attacks. Though led by a veteran of the Africa campaign, Squadron Leader John F. Jackson, they were mostly inexperienced. Only 4 of the 21 pilots had seen combat, including Jackson, and they had only completed 9 days of training before being deployed. From the 21st of March onward, the squadron saw action almost every day until the end of April, often against superior numbers, and the inexperience took its toll. 3 aircraft crashed on the second day of operations, and the rookie pilots were shocked by the aggressiveness and skill of their opponents. They often encountered the dreaded A6M20, and some of their best pilots were veterans from combat over China, the Philippines, and Java. The instincts of an inexperienced pilot did not play well to the P-40's strengths. A desire to outmaneuver, rather than outrun, gave the advantage to the Zero and led to a sharp rise in casualties. This was further exacerbated by the spread of disease, which, combined with everything else, became a real hit to morale. This was then made even worse when Squadron Leader Jackson himself was shot down and killed on April the 28th, with command passing to his younger brother, Squadron Leader Les Jackson. When the squadron was finally relieved at the end of the month, they had just 3 serviceable aircraft left, and 7 more were in urgent need of repairs. In this first tour of duty, the squadron had 35 confirmed victories, another 4 probables, and had damaged a further 44 Japanese aircraft. But they had paid a high price. The squadron had lost 22 aircraft and 12 pilots. Taking his brother's place, Les Jackson helped to reform the squadron during its 2-month refitting period back in Australia. Many lessons had to be taken to heart, as well as an appreciation for the P-40's strengths. This respite allowed the squadron to complete the training that had been cut short in March, and this, combined with their harrowing combat experience, led to the development of new tactics, maintenance procedures, and flying habits. After their 2-month respite was finished, 75 Squadron went back to New Guinea for frontline duties once again, but this time they were far more confident with their aircraft. Joined by the Kitty Hawks of No. 76 Squadron, they redeployed to Milne Bay at the end of July. It was during the Battle of Milne Bay, and those that followed, that the Australian Kitty Hawks, and those flown elsewhere by New Zealanders, would accomplish some of their highest achievements. Not only did they fend off the Japanese air attacks that threatened Allied troops and their limited supplies, but in turn, they conducted multiple strikes against Japanese ground troops, and this had a significant impact on the battle. Japanese troops had limited anti-air defenses, and the Kitty Hawks were able to absorb large amounts of small arms fire as they completed numerous bombing and strafing runs. They also had the range and endurance to conduct multiple missions a day with minimal service work needed between sorties, unless something managed to fall off. This meant that the Kitty Hawks were in an almost constant state of action, providing much needed support to the defenders and putting extreme pressure on the invading Japanese. Unlike their previous outing, the Australian Kitty Hawks fared far better against Japanese fighters when the combats resumed, especially against the Zeros. This was not due to any serious upgrade or modifications, but rather due to a correction of doctrine. Veteran Kitty Hawk pilots had often complained that the aircraft was rarely allowed to be used to its strengths. In Africa, the training given to pilots had never been fully suitable for the P-40, being more suitable for a Spitfire or a Hurricane. The P-40 was a high-speed, low-altitude, 6-gun sledgehammer of a plane, and the Desert Air Force had tried to wield it like a fine sabre. The Royal Australian Air Force had no sort of illusions, and after 75 Squadron's disastrous beginning, they soon learned to fly the Kitty Hawk in the ways that suited it best. The result was not a complete tipping of the scales, with the P-40 reigning supreme, but rather a balancing of forces. The Kitty Hawks continued to take fairly heavy losses, but they also inflicted an equal amount of loss on their opponents. It was often a question of pilot discipline, as the strengths and weaknesses of the two aircraft were often their polar opposites. The P-40 turned better at high speeds, the Zero at slow speeds. The P-40 was slower in a climb, but faster in a dive, and the Zero was lighter and considered easier to handle, but often lacked firepower and sturdiness. Basically, if the P-40 was strictly used for boom and zoom attacks, diving on its opponent, squeezing off a burst of machine gun fire, and zooming away, they'd be fine. If they got dragged into a slow dogfight, they'd lose. Milne Bay ended with victory for the Allies, and the first time that the Japanese forces were driven into a total withdrawal. The use of P-40s in ground attacks made a decisive impact. On the first day of the invasion, the Kitty Hawks of 75 and 76 Squadron did much to blunt the initial advance, denying air superiority to the enemy and buying critical time for the defenders. Afterwards, their daily strafing runs made up for the local deficit in manpower, until more reinforcements could be funneled in, and at the same time they assisted in denying the same reinforcements to the enemy. Milne Bay was a major chapter in the history of the Australian Air Force, but the P-40's work was far from over. Air combat over New Guinea would continue for almost 2 years, with multiple sorties over Port Moresby, Milne Bay, and other parts of the island. Though the Spitfires did begin to make an appearance, most of the action was fought with the Kitty Hawks. They were the most numerous fighter operated by the Australians, and they were generally very popular with their pilots. Kitty Hawks would end up flying with 8 Australian squadrons in total, seeing action mostly over New Guinea and Borneo, and they would remain in service for the entirety of the war. But it was those early actions during the invasion of New Guinea that would establish its long-lasting prestige with the Australian Air Force, and the Kitty Hawks over Milne Bay are treated with the same reverence as the Spitfires and Hurricanes that fought in the Battle of Britain. That's how important the P-40 was. Eventually, the Japanese were pushed back farther north, and most of the Australian squadrons settled down for a life of home defence and patrols over the southwest Pacific. Though it was an Australian Kitty Hawk that would score the aircraft's last victory for the Commonwealth forces, shooting down a Key 61 on June 10, 1944, it would be the P-40s in service with New Zealand and the US that saw out some of its last major operations. The Solomon Islands was the last Pacific campaign that saw the P-40 used in large numbers. The 44th Fighter Squadron of the Army Air Force arrived on January 20th, 1943. Racking up 117.5 confirmed kills, they became the highest-scoring P-40 squadron of the year. Just under half of these victories were scored over a 2-month period during the invasions of Rendover Island and New Georgia. Not far behind them were the New Zealanders. P-40s from No. 14 and 15 Squadron claimed 99 kills between mid-1943 and 1944, with over half of these being Mitsubishi Zeros. Despite these stunning results, particularly against newer and more advanced Japanese fighters, the P-40's major service was pretty much done by the end of the year. The New Zealand Kitty Hawks were being swapped out for Vought F4U Corsairs, the Australians were replacing theirs with the P-38 Lightnings, as were the Americans, and in the ground attack role, the P-47 and the P-51s now reigned supreme. The transition was mostly complete by the summer of 1944, and by September, no P-40s were operated by dedicated fighter squadrons in the Pacific Theatre. They continued to see frontline use until the end of the war though, but this was mostly in the service of reconnaissance or training squadrons. Some did see action during the retaking of the Philippines, scoring the P-40's last aerial victories in January of 1945, but their numbers were few and their usage was brief. Despite this mild anticlimax, it did mean that the P-40 had remained in frontline service for the entirety of the Pacific War. The only other US fighter to match this achievement was the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. Following the war, a huge number of P-40s still survived, but their post-war service was brief and mostly boring. The only US P-40s still in service were with training units, and these were all struck off charge and placed into storage. The P-40s in Australia and New Zealand were put into storage, or auctioned off, with a few being retained by collectors, and the same happened over in Canada. In smaller air forces, the P-40s found post-war use as trainers or reserve aircraft, and the last military P-40s remained in service all the way into the mid-1950s. These were the P-40s of the Brazilian Air Force, and when the last unit was officially retired, it brought an end to a long, varied, and surprisingly successful service history. Over 13,700 P-40s had been built. They had served with over a dozen different nations, and between them, over 200 pilots from these nations had become aces flying the P-40. It had proven itself to be a competent fighter when flown to its strengths, and its sturdiness allowed many inexperienced pilots to make mistakes that would have killed them in other aircraft. But even more importantly, it performed its role as a fighter bomber so well that, in many operations, it had a significant impact on the outcome of battle. El Alamein, Burma, New Guinea, Borneo, all of these battles saw Warhawks and Kitty Hawks hitting the enemy on the ground, blunting their advance, and often bringing much-needed relief. But, putting aside the physical impact of the P-40, be that as a fighter or a fighter-bomber, its biggest impact on any front was the psychological change it brought to the Pacific. The first 6 months following Pearl Harbor had been a low point for Allied pilots in that theater. Japanese fighters and bombers reigned supreme, the Zero was practically a flying boogeyman, and they always seemed to outnumber and outfight their untrained and unprepared opponents. The Kitty Hawks over New Guinea did much to dispel this illusion of invulnerability, and its exploits there, and in subsequent campaigns, brought a much-needed morale boost. This was perhaps most true for the pilots of the Royal Australian Air Force, whose small numbers had been decimated by the Japanese at the start of the conflict. In fact, it's probably not a huge stretch to say that the Australian pilots loved their P-40s far more than any others, and there's good reason for that. The P-40 was the first mass-produced fighter to see extensive service with Australia, and it was sorely needed. They were short on fighters when the Pacific War began, promised shipments of British aircraft were being absorbed by the needs in Europe, and their air forces would have been completely overwhelmed if not for the timely arrival of the Kitty Hawk. It came just in time to make just enough of a difference to tip the balance in the Allies' favour, and in many ways that is a good summary for the P-40's success. It wasn't the best aircraft of the war. It was flawed, its engine was underpowered, it didn't like high altitudes, the early models had stability problems, and the later models were a bit fat. But they were good enough. They weren't amazing, but they weren't bad either. They were good, a solid 7 out of 10, a B average. They were what was needed at the crucial hour. But was that also a bad thing? Just a few weeks after Curtiss-Wright rolled out its 15,000th fighter in 1944, production of the P-40 would cease. Despite their best efforts, they would never win a contract to produce a fighter ever again, and just 4 years later the company walked away from aircraft production for good. In a cruel sense of irony, the long-lasting success of the P-40 had its part to play in the company's downfall. From the outset, the effectiveness of the P-40 as a frontline fighter was expected to be brief, and as early as 1939, before the first production model had even left the factory, Curtiss was already considering its replacement. The company had two choices. They could radically improve the design of the P-40, or come up with a new aircraft to replace it. With the outbreak of the war in Europe, and further funding from Congress, they had the luxury of pursuing both options. But in the long run, this would actually do more harm than good. The P-40's success as an export model far exceeded the expectations of both Curtiss-Wright and the Army. Because of this, attempts to either improve or replace it were hampered by the pressing need to keep the existing production line going. This in turn had a knock-on effect on engine development. Allison fully appreciated the drawbacks of the V-1710, but any attempts to improve the design had to be done in a way that wouldn't interfere with P-40 production. Additionally, and as mentioned earlier, Allison wasn't a huge company. They didn't have the manpower to spare on adventurous design projects, and as it was, they were barely expanding fast enough to keep up with the growing demand for existing engines. The fact that the last P-40s to be built were only somewhat better performing than the first speaks volumes to this particular problem. Things were then further complicated following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Not only did Curtiss-Wright have to continue supplying Tomahawks and Kitty Hawks to overseas customers, but they now had the US Army breathing down their neck, with a blank check and a desire for superhuman production levels. This had a direct impact on the development of the P-40's replacement. Between 1939 and 1942, 3 aircraft were designed as potential replacements of the P-40, the XP-46, the XP-53, and the XP-60. The XP-46 was an attempt to make do with the limited power of the Allison engine by reducing the size and weight of the airframe. The result was a small, agile-looking aircraft that initially held much promise. In fact, the British Purchasing Commission placed an order for the XP-46 and were originally going to give it the name of Kitty Hawk. Things changed when the aircraft was actually put through testing, and its low firepower, short range, and lack of armor protection made it totally unsuitable as a frontline fighter. The final nail in the coffin was the fact that it couldn't exceed the current speed of the existing P-40s, and the project was abandoned. The XP-53 was another failed attempt. It was larger than the XP-46, was meant to have superior range to the P-40, and with its laminar flow wings it was hoped to handle better as well, but this time it was let down by a new engine, the Continental 1430. Following this came the XP-60. Combining the wing design of the XP-53 with the fuselage of a P-40D and a Packard Merlin engine, this aircraft looked promising, but it was deemed too heavy to make efficient use of the Merlin engine, and the solution was to fit a turbocharged version of the Allison V-1710 instead. This required a major redesign of the fuselage, but it could be done, and the concept was sound. Though this is where the P-40's success does come back to haunt it. Allison had made some progress in the development of turbocharged engines, but it was still an emerging technology for them, and most of their resources were put into producing the current supercharged engines for the P-40. The result was a mostly untried and untested power plant that had an alarming tendency to catch fire. Equipped with this temperamental engine, the XP-60 became the XP-60A, and although it was a flying fire hazard, it did fly faster and higher than the existing P-40s. Additionally, another P-60 was built with a Pratt & Whitney R2800 Cyclone, and this became the XP-60C. By the time the XP-60A had flown, the US Army was losing interest in the project. Curtiss quickly provided them with estimated performance figures for the XP-60C, and this was enough to renew their interest, which even resulted in an order for 500 aircraft as the P-60. Following a series of experiments, this version was selected in favor of the Merlin-powered variant, though there was a concern about the supply of contra-rotating propellers. Because of this, another prototype was developed, known as the XP-60E. Unfortunately, a string of bad luck, delays, and other engineering problems would stop the P-60 from ever entering production. Eventually, the order for 500 was cancelled, and only 5 prototypes were ever built. I'm only providing a quick history on this aircraft, as it will be getting its own video in the future, though I do want to mention that if Curtiss could have spared more manpower on this project, it could have had a brighter future. One last attempt to breathe new life into the P-40 itself was the XP-40Q, and even though this was technically successful, it was too little too late. It was a heavily modified P-40K. It had a thinner nose, with the cooling system relocated into the wing roots, it had a new bubble canopy, its wings were eventually clipped, and further modifications to the fuselage and intake system gave it a strong resemblance to the P-51 Mustang. With a vastly more powerful engine, the 1800 horsepower-121 version of the Allison, it was much faster than the old P-40s. But this experiment took place in mid-1943. By now, the P-38, P-47, and P-51 were all entering service. The P-38 could fly further, the P-47 could carry more bombs, and the P-51 was faster. And so, the XP-40Q, like the rest, failed. The P-40 was not the direct cause for the failure of Curtiss. Indeed, poor management decisions and some highly questionable design choices in other aircraft did most of the work for them. But it is ironic that the company's most successful aircraft had a hand in its departure from the world of aviation. Thankfully, this fact does little to tar the reputation of the P-40 in the grand scale of things. Though that being said, the P-40 has often been treated more harshly than it deserves. Today, that seems to be changing. The more reflective research that is done on the P-40, the more it's appreciated that it was in fact a very capable aircraft, just one that was often let down by outdated or unsuitable combat doctrine. After all, if you don't fly a fighter to its strengths, how can you rightfully judge its performance? A lot of the P-40's early heavy losses have since been put down to a combination of poor training and poor combat tactics, something that makes even more sense when you compare the victory and loss ratios of the P-40s later in the war. Despite being more outclassed in 1943 than ever before, the P-40s over the Mediterranean and the Pacific brought down far more enemy aircraft per loss than at any other period. Thankfully, the P-40's huge production run meant that, despite their heavy losses, a good number of them do survive today. A surviving example of most major P-40 variants can be found, including the sole surviving P-40B that was present during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Because of this, they are often a regular and popular sight at airshows, big and small, thus continuing the 80-year legacy of a plane that did far more than it was ever expected to achieve. And that concludes today's look at the P-40. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the patrons. This video was a bit of a challenge to finish, as I had a lot of other things going on, so I've had to record this in about 4 or 5 segments, so I apologise if my voice is a bit all over the place. But at least I got it released in the same month as part 1. A special shout out, of course, to the Wing Commander patrons, the highest tier supporters, and a big welcome to Robert Hedges and Brooks Martin, who are the newest members of this special group. I've already started working on next month's Q&A video, so all your questions will be answered then, and you guys should be getting some sneak peeks at some very special stuff very soon. But, as always, thank you all so much, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.